All right. Good morning, everyone, and happy Sabbath. It is July 3, Sabbath for the 4th of July weekend. I hope you all are having a good long weekend. I'm here with my beautiful wife, Jody. So it's John and Jody Griffin. Guess we should change the name. I'm going to talk a little bit here. Oh, Sam already changed the name. So we have our pastor, Sam, who was on board here just a minute ago. And we are doing Sabbath school here at 9:30, again, July 3 from Eastside SDA Fellowship. So people are going to be signing up here shortly. Watch this meeting a little bit later. The chapter we're discussing right now is in the book of Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 55. And it's entitled The Child Samuel. So I want to set a little bit of context for that. And Sam hates it when I make apologies right up front. But I want to just say I wanted to get a multi-generational panel together, which was my dad, who was a John Griffin, and then my son, who's a John Griffin. But with this being a holiday weekend and stuff, everyone was a little busier than I was hoping and not able to make it. So it's going to be anyone else who signs up. I am going to get started though. So I want to set a little bit of context. And I did do a little research, and I would say this is always a little stressful for me, and I've done this a couple times. But I always learn something and feel like I'm blessed by having to do a little bit of background work and read and then reread some of this stuff. And I would encourage you, if you feel it in your heart that you want to take on some leadership responsibility, to let Pastor Sam or any of the other elders know. And we can certainly get you hooked up and potentially get you leading the Sabbath school. So a little bit of context. Israel goes through 40 years in the desert and finally enter the promised land without Moses, who took them through the 40 years in the desert. And then they bring, so Joshua is the one that brings them into the promised land. Unfortunately for Israel, they did a fairly good job of conquering all of the people, the heathen people in the promised land, and established themselves in the land of milk and honey, where things are very good for them. Unfortunately, though, they did not conquer all of the people. And so we're left with some of these heathen influences that ultimately ends up corrupting them to some degree. And so once they get to the promised land and they don't have Moses, Joshua becomes the first of what we call judges. And there's a whole book in the Bible called Judges. And I looked up the dates for judges, and Joshua was a judge starting in 1398 BC. So don't forget, this is BC. So any of these dates go from bigger to smaller over the number of years that he was a judge. So then I wanted to put it into context. So when was Samuel a judge? And Samuel was a judge starting in 1094. So 1398 minus 1094 is roughly 300 years. Did I get that right?
What are you saying?
My wife's a teacher, so I'm going to ask her some of these questions. 1398 BC is when Joshua was a judge, and then 1094 was when Samuel was a judge.
Yes.
So it's roughly this 300-year period, and I counted the number of judges, and there were about 16 from what I can tell, depending on some of these minor judges that were there. And it's not, you can look up several timelines, which is interesting, but it's not a perfect timeline because there weren't always a judge. I mean, there was gaps between judges. And then it turns out, and I found this surprising, and one thing I learned from doing a little research on this is there were some judges that actually overlapped. and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. Well, actually, I think I'll get into that right now. So I started reading this chapter 55, the child Samuel in Patriarchs and Prophets. And right before it was this chapter on Samson. And it's chapter 54 entitled Samson. And I thought, well, that's cool, because I could title this whole Sabbath school, The Tale of Two Sams. And then our pastor's name is Sam, which is short for Samuel, but I don't see why Samson can be short. Sam can be short for Samson either. And then it got me thinking other names that Sam could be short for, and I'll let you look into that and speculate on that. Samantha is a common female name.
The Sam of Sams.
Who's the Sam of Sams?
Sam.
Oh,
Sam is.
so Sam, although you can't see him, is commenting in the chat box saying he is the Sam of Sams, unless he's referring himself to Samson. I mean, I guess the perfect Sam, since Pastor Sam's obviously listening, would be the strength of Samson with the integrity of Samuel. But maybe one person can't have it all. So anyway, so then I was looking at these timelines. So I actually did read the chapter on Samson, reread it in context of the chapter on Samuel. And it was amazing, the parallels. I mean, presumably this is roughly the same time period. And so then that's the thing that just blew me away. We'll talk about parallels in just a minute. But I was like, well, where is Samson in relation to Samuel? And it depends on who you look at. And there's a little bit of controversy because of these gaps and stuff. But Samson, the best resource I could find that made the most sense, Samson was a judge of Israel for roughly 20 years, and presumably started roughly 20. He started in 1118 and went to 1078. So, and there's ranges between 20 and 40 years that, well, the Bible says he was a judge for 20 years, so I can't help but believe that because I'm not going to go against the Bible. But then I looked at when Samuel was a judge, and it says 1098 to 1014. And that means that there was potentially some overlap between Samson and Samuel. And when I did the math on this earlier, so I won't bug my wife about the math on that, especially since it's this wonky BC math and not AD like we're used to. Samson ended his time as a judge with his death when Samuel was approximately 16 years old. And this whole time, Eli is also part of Israel as the high priest, presumably. And so it's interesting to me that you have these people kind of around at the same time. And so Samuel was a younger contemporary of Samson. Eli overlapped both of them. So when I looked up Eli, just so you know, he went from 1134, which predated Samson by approximately 16 years, to 1094. So he lived to be a good 60 plus years before, if you remember, he was a heavy man and he fell over when he found out that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken by the Philistines and died this tragic death, basically with a broken neck kind of a thing. Anyway, so I did a little bit more research, and actually Samson overlapped with Jephthah. And I don't know how much we got into that in Sabbath schools, but Jephthah was in the northern kingdom with the Ammonites, while Samson was in the southern part of the kingdom in Dan, which dealt with the Philistines. And he actually went down even farther because we have him ending up in Gaza at least once, and maybe twice. That might have been where he was jailed. So I don't know. I found that fascinating that these people are all kind of contemporaries of each other. So then the other thing I found fascinating, and this will get us into the lesson a little bit more, is that Samson, well, Samson was basically a child of promise, like Samuel was. Both of these people came from families that were childless. And Samson had an angel coming to his mom and dad, who sounds like they were on the outskirt, kind of like the West was in America, where it was a little bit more involved with Philistines and stuff. But he was a child of promise, and he was set up as a Nazirite, which I knew about. And I think most people do, because, he's not supposed to be drinking wine. He's not supposed to be cutting his hair. And he's not supposed to be defiling himself with dead bodies, whether it's human or non-human. Those are kind of the criteria. But Samson is kind of the best example, or at least the best known example of a Nazirite from child and supposed to be that way for his whole life. Well, I don't know if you picked up on it, but chapter 55, when you get into that, and when you look at the text, all of a sudden it's Samuel is also set up as a Nazirite. And so then that led me to kind of look, what other Nazirites are there in the Bible? And it's interesting because this Nazirite thing is a consecration. And both Samson and Samuel were consecrated at birth and for the rest of their lives as Nazirites. Now, that wasn't always the case. And if you look in the Old Testament, there's some very specific things that have to do with being a Nazirite. And you could do it short term. And a good example of that is Paul ends up doing it. And then the other, probably most famous Nazirite that we know of, and there's really only these four that I could find in the Bible, was John the Baptist. And I guess you could argue he might have been a Nazirite for his whole life as well. Anyway, just some things that I thought were interesting while we're getting into this lesson. So as people sign in, raise your hand or throw something into the chat box to get my attention. I think Sam has people coming in both muted and without their video, so you would have to undo your video and undo your mute once it gets time to talking. But this chapter 55, the child Samuel, covers 1 Samuel 1 through 1 Samuel 2:11. And I actually did a quick summary of it, so indulge me. And then I want to get to some of the heart of this story. And again, Samuel shows up. So he's kind of the last of the judges. And he's the one that brings, Israel wants a king, and he's the one that brings in Saul as king, which was a disappointment. And then also brings in David. And he's also someone that many people see as a compassionate person that prefigures Christ in many ways. And he was different than a lot of the judges in that he covered a lot of Israel. And just this is the last thing, and then I'll get into the text. He basically came from a wealthy family, and that's kind of the first part of the text and the first part of the chapter. Talks about Elkanah was a man of wealth and influence, and one who loved and feared the Lord. And that's the first sentence in chapter 55. And so when I was reading on Samuel a little bit, a lot of this wealth apparently went to him. And he would do this circuit. He was kind of like a circuit minister that would go throughout Israel. And partly because he didn't want to impose on the Israelites by having them have to come to Shiloh, which I'll get back to in a minute. But then also, and that would get him away from work and away from earning their living. But he also, with his wealth and influence, would bring his family with them and had a camp that would follow him around. And he would use his own money and his own means to support himself so that he wasn't using the resources of the Israelites as he did his circuits to bring the word of God to the people. Now, a quick word on Shiloh. Because I myself read this chapter once or twice, and it wasn't until I got into the Bible text that I realized the Shiloh was where the center of worship was for Israel at the time. And it was literally the tabernacle that had been in the desert with that whole sacrificial system that was still going. and Elkanah lived just slightly north of that, I believe. So the text in the Bible starts out, there was a certain man who was from Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, and he had two wives. One was Hannah, and the other was Peninnah. And they would go to Shiloh every year to worship. And I mentioned Eli was the high priest. Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And this is another interesting compare and contrast. We looked at Samson, we've looked at Samuel, but we also, have Hophni and Phinehas in the picture now, which is interesting. Anyway, Hannah could not have children, and this was a significant source of distress for her. And Ellen White in chapter 55 talks about Elkanah wasn't happy with this either. And so this is what led him to bring on a second wife. And then this ended up being a source of significant discord in the family, even though that he did have children with Peninnah. Anyway, Eli is sitting in the chair at the doorpost of the Lord's house. Again, the tabernacle in Shiloh, very similar to what Moses probably did. And Hannah leaves the dinner, which is this celebration dinner after all the sacrifices, didn't eat, even though she got a double portion. And she's in distress. And she comes to the Lord's house, and she's off to the side praying to God through her mind. I mean, basically lipping the words and praying to God. But Eli sees that, and this is a good indication of where Israel was at the time, and just assumes she's drunk. So apparently this isn't a common occurrence. And he calls her out. He's like, "How long are you going to stay drunk?" And she says, "No, not so, my Lord. I am deeply distressed." And she explains to him what goes on. And then there's two prophecies that happen here, actually three. Eli says, "May the God of Israel grant you what you've asked him." And sure enough, Hannah goes home, becomes pregnant, and then promises to bring Samuel back to Eli and the tabernacle where he will serve the rest of his life, but not until after he is weaned. And then when she does go back with her sacrifices, there's this amazing prayer, which I might forget later on, that ends with the words, "He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." And obviously Israel doesn't have a king then that is anointed. And so this is the second two prophecies. This king is a reference to ultimately David, but it started with Saul. And then some people think that this anointed part is a farther down the road reference to Jesus himself. All right. Sorry for me talking for 15 full minutes there. Any thoughts, Jody?
Well, I think Hannah has reasons to be distressed, so no problem there. That her husband brings in wife number two, that's problematic. And wife number two manages to have children, so that's problematic. So yeah, I think there's a lot of problems setting up here. So I think with Hannah committing, maybe this was part of her prayer and part of her, like, I don't know, maybe bargaining with God when Elkanah thought that she was really drunk, but she's not. Maybe that was kind of her bargaining thing, like, hey, if I have a kid, then I'll dedicate him to the Lord, and I'll do this and I'll do that. Maybe that was all part of it. I really don't know.
Well, that's an interesting segue, because I submitted 3 questions, and I think it showed up in the church newsletter. But the first question was, we all have struggles, and you're talking about Hannah not having children, struggle for her. And then I said, we all want yes answers to our prayers. And then the questions are, why do we celebrate the yes answers to our prayers? And then what struggles and no answers have we had in retrospect where God is still working in our lives and still answering our prayers? And what examples are there in the Bible, specifically where God said no, and there in answer to that, it's interesting. We're talking in Pages to Progress. I'll throw that out there. This book entitled "Saying No to God," and it talks about how God is not offended if we challenge Him and struggle with Him on different issues. And ultimately, He wants a relationship. And within that relationship, it ends up being something that strengthens our faith. But there are instances in the Bible where God pretty much puts his foot down and says no. So I guess the question is, in our lives or the listeners' lives, are there instances where God has said no? And in retrospect, you look back and you realize God was still working and it was still the right thing, even though we all wanted a yes answer to prayer.
Well, I always like to reference one of my favorites, Garth Brooks, who has this song that's titled Unanswered Prayers, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically the story of him going to a football game or whatever, and he's there with his wife and family, and he runs into an old girlfriend, and he realizes that God knew what he was doing back in the day when he was, praying that he would have this relationship with this girl, and then he doesn't. And so then the song goes on to I thank God for unanswered prayers. And I kind of try to keep that in perspective, because I think sometimes we want to know, we think we know what's best. And so the answer might be no, because God does know what's better for us in a relationship or a different situation. Doesn't have to be just a relationship, but different situations. And we don't understand it at the time, and we may argue with God, and we may try to bargain, or we may try to do whatever. But yeah, there are instances where God says no, because he does know, but we just don't understand it. We don't have the depth of knowledge to understand.
Yeah, it's I think specifically in our lives, we ended up in Utah after I finished residency in surgery in 2003, and we left a partnership there in 2004, and it was 4 years later in 2007. And man, that was a rough time for us, because it brought us to almost zero financially and professionally and financially. And we had no idea how we were going to make it. We obviously had family that was willing to help and things like that, but we were getting sued by my ex-partner. He was threatening us, and it was a low point. And I knew where I wanted to be professionally, but I didn't know how we were going to get there. And it literally took a year or two. It ultimately ended up taking almost, I don't know,
too long,
a long time before everything was settled. But a year or two before we realized we were where we wanted to be, and that God had gotten us there, but that it was by a route that we would have never chosen. But it was his will and his way, and it ended up being the best way. So yeah, I would consider that, I was praying for the yes. I felt like I got the no, but it ultimately came out in the end. It's interesting, because just while I'm talking about that, I guess the converse of the question would be, have you ever prayed for something and got a yes, in retrospect realized it should have been a no?
I don't know if somebody online wants to respond to that. I think when I was sometimes, Marvin, go ahead.
Marvin, you're muted.
Hello. Hi. Happy Sabbath, everyone. Don't be alarmed. By this odd thing over my eye. I'll tell you the story later. It had to do with someone opening a car door into their own face. I could talk about specifics, but in general, very early on in my professional career, after at the time being experiencing a really, really bitter disappointment. I only got through that by trusting in God. And it's interesting because even at that time, I was believing that God had me in his hand and that he would care for me and my family and open the right doors. But you can say that and believe it and obey, right? That faith relationship with God, but still just be going through such a difficult time emotionally, especially when your pride's involved or fear or things like that. But you know, I always distrusted myself the most when it came to my career because I can be such a competitive person, and there's so much that's bound up, especially for guys, you know, in their jobs and how they view themselves, how they think other people view them. So from that experience onward, every time I came to a crossroads professionally, I would fervently pray that God would not just deliver my heart's desire, but actually that he would open and close doors, because I knew that I couldn't really trust myself ultimately in that department from experience. So it's funny because now, I fervently believe that every time there was a crossroads that God opened the correct door for me. And I feel so blessed, professionally, and how that has harmonized spiritually as well as personally, in terms of the right impact on my family, not just financially, but also in terms of the work-life balance. So now it's interesting because I've come full circle. My daughter Tabitha, as you all know, has just graduated from grad school. Right? So guys all have that to look forward to someday. My oldest actually has done her master's degree, and she's now in the process of applying to jobs. And there's no small amount of trepidation and uncertainty about that. I tell her, on the one hand, you don't want to just sit on your hands and say, "Oh, God's going to provide," right, and use that as an excuse for really irresponsible behavior. So I told her, look, just cast the net out wide, apply to every possible job. When you've done your due diligence, when you've been a faithful, individual or responsible individual, at that point, then you next step is you pray and you say, hey, there are all these options. I don't know which one's best. Certainly, I prefer this. This is what I think is really cool. This is where I think I'll make the kind of money I'd like to. But best, Lord, open the right door and close the wrong doors that I may otherwise walk through, because in my limited, human understanding and my pride and my desire, I might walk through not knowing that it's the wrong path for me.
Yeah. So I had a question for you, Marvin. I shared, probably one of the worst experiences in our life, at least, where we felt like we were at a low point. But I'll tell you, I look back on that as one of the worst experiences, but also look back on that as one of those times in my life where both my wife and I were 100% unified in knowing that God was going to get us through this. We never lost any sleep. There was some sweat and tears, but I remember being able to sleep. I look back and I'm like, how could you ever sleep with all that stuff over your head? And God was good. I mean, he gave us a peace then that I actually look back on in a very positive way, no matter how negative that situation was.
No, I agree. I look back at my lowest points from my human standpoint, the points of either greatest disappointment or failure, or fear, and I wouldn't, seek after that. I mean, yeah, let's do that again. But absolutely, what those are probably some of the moments, the periods in life where you feel the closest to God, where you just feel His tangible presence, and that's because you strip away all the facade of ability and self-reliance that we all kid ourselves into thinking that we're capable and impactful individuals. We are to some extent, but from a cosmic sense, we aren't. Right? It could all just be stripped away, like Job. And unlike Job, it could be because of our own hubris or bad decisions or just some terrible tragedy. And in those moments, you really feel God personally present, and it's a blessing. You actually, and then when you come to additional moments like that, you can build on that. You say, hey, He was there, and it was absolutely Him, and so I know that He will be here again.
Yeah. So I saw Sam flash up on the screen. I don't know if he had something he wanted to say or.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly share and resonate with all that's been shared. There's a song lyric that came to mind. Thank God for the ships that never made it out of the bay. And I look back at my life and I look at all the twists and turns that have taken place, and I really do have to thank God for the ships that never made it out of the bay, because there were so many experiences where I'm just super grateful where God was leading me. One of those experiences I'll quickly share, probably the best part of 4 years ago, I imagine, is that I was very close to getting a job in Vancouver. And it seemed like it made sense. The doors were opened up and there were a bunch of different candidates, etc. And at the beginning, I wasn't that particularly excited about the job. And then I eventually became excited. Long story short, loads of different candidates, whittled down to the last few. I was one of the last few. And then I didn't get it. And after investing so much time and energy and effort into thinking that's where God is guiding you, to find out that's where apparently God isn't, is very challenging to deal with, very difficult to deal with. I can think of another experience after I finished seminary. I had a plane ticket and a visa booked to actually go and work for a year in Korea. Wow. And everything was set 2 weeks before. Everything was pulled under the rug, and it didn't work out for different reasons, and another story for another time. But I could come up with countless stories where the ships never made it out of the bay. And I look back at those experiences, and then I look forward to now where I am. And I just really do praise God because my life would have been really different. It's not to say that my life wouldn't have been blessed, but my life would have been very different. And I'm grateful of how it's turned out now. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And again, we're about a half hour into this. If someone wants to say something, raise your hand or put something in the chat box.
I would like to say something.
Yes, Kosuke, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Yeah. Hi, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So I guess that we are talking about our low point, right? Sharing the low point session. Yeah. So
and how God worked through.
Yeah. So funny that we just having a 30-year wedding anniversary soon this month.
That's not a low point, is it?
No, it's not. But we are talking. So I was thinking about after marriage. Funny thing is, I have so the first 10 years, second 10 years, and third 10 years, I had a different job, and we lived in a different location too. So that was very interesting how God guided us. But the low point was that at the end of the second 10th year, because I was working for a bank, and the bank closed the operation in many regional branches and tried to bring the people to New York, basically. So I lost a job, and that was a tough experience because all the people laid off is over 50. So so it's very tough for the some people in Chicago, some people Dallas, Seattle, many locations, and it was very tough. But one thing I tell you is that that experience unified that as a family,
Mhm.
And Darlene certainly that helped me a lot. I mean, financially, spiritually, she's, you know, and God gave me a different job, and so I was very I've been blessed, and so yeah, I just wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Kosuke. It's been good having you here the last 10 years.
Even though you've been here 5.
Yeah, we've been here 5 years. We've been here half of
Almost.
that. So, so then I had this little bit of a monologue comparing Samuel to Samson earlier on. I'm not going to repeat it, but this is a segue into the next question, the second of 3 questions. And so I'll just read it, and I want to get people's opinions on it, and we'll see where it leads us. So many of us have children, and obviously get to decide how we want to raise them. And so this story, Samuel, and the story about Samson has an interesting compare and contrast of how children can be raised and how they can ultimately turn out. And so this kind of led me to think, how much control do we have as parents and with how they turn out? And then that kind of leads into the third question, honestly. Well, so I'm not going to go to the third question yet because it's a little bit different, but I'm basically with the second question getting into this nature versus nurture kind of concept, with nature kind of being inherently what a person is and nurture being what that person can become. And this is obviously in the context of raising children and how they turn out. And then I think we'll talk a little bit about families and adulthood in the next question a little bit more. So my wife is a teacher, and she gets to see these children, at least at the 8th grade level, and gets to interact with the parents. Obviously, we are parents, and we have our own children, and it's pretty amazing how they will pick up it. Well, I'm talking too much again, but we have a son and a daughter, a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old. And my 19-year-old is very much like Jody in kind of his personality. You know, he's somewhat competitive, but can take it or leave it. Pretty easygoing, laid back. Somewhat, yeah. My daughter is very much more competitive, a little bit more of a tit for tat kind of a person. And she will admit she's a lot more like me. Easy to speak up, speak out, and sometimes experiences the heat of the moment and has to back down and change things, make things up.
No, you said JC was just like me. I'm not sure that's accurate.
Oh, he
but-
looks like me,
Well, I
but
know.
personality-wise, he's like you.
I don't know about that.
All right.
I end up apologizing to my kids whenever I do see them, like have any kind of characteristics, and I apologize to Jamie more than JC, I think, but it's okay.
So nature, nurture, what do you see in the classroom?
Oh,
What do you
goodness.
think? I mean, I think
I don't wanna get off
ultimately
on
it's a
this.
combination of the two.
Yeah, I'm not 100% one way or the other, because obviously, I mean, I think some things are inherent, there's no doubt about that. But I also, I have students that are adopted, and they're just like their adoptive parents. So it's hard for me to say about that. I do think that it's a difficult thing. I mean, and I don't care which side you're on, nature or nurture. It's just a daily grind, no matter what you pick, I guess.
So then, and I mean, this is something even professionals just debate and talk about ultimately, and often in the context of someone doing something horrendously wrong and hitting the news, and it's kind of like, how could they do that? And the idea is, is it just in their nature, or was there a failure in their parents? And so then that ultimately kind of leans up with the group that would promote the nurture part of it.
Yeah, I get that. But when it's both, I mean, it's hard to distinguish, I guess.
Okay.
But I think, with anyone, I mean, kids, just like anyone else out there, has the power of choice. And I want to come back to the story a little bit.
Mhm.
When I don't know if this says 571, 572, I don't know where the distinction is here. But it talks about when Samuel went to Eli, it says, when separated from her child, this is going back to Hannah, the faithful mother solicitude did not cease. Every day he was the subject of her prayers. And I think that's how it has to be with us too. It's like, pray for our children daily, because we can influence them and we pray that they make good choices. But ultimately, I mean, it's just like us. Did we do everything your parents wanted you to do?
Well, that's getting into the next question.
Okay. Well, I'm saying we can influence all we want, but I think ultimately people make their own choices, whether they're our children or employees or anything else. That people do have the power of choice. So I think keeping our children and our prayers daily is definitely.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up that one. That's on page 572. Yeah, it's this paragraph. It's pretty amazing. When separated from her child, the faithful mother's solicitude did not cease. Every day he was the subject of her prayers, and every year she made with her own hands a robe of service for him. And as she went up with her husband to worship at Shiloh, she gave the child this reminder of her love. Every fiber of the little garment had been woven with a prayer that he might be pure, noble, and true. She did not ask for her son worldly greatness, but she earnestly pleaded that he might attain the greatness which heaven values, that he might honor God and bless his fellow man. And boy, you couldn't have asked for a better thing for any kid, I guess. And I think we all pray for our kids. But I think as a mother, the prayers are going to be a little different than as a father often, and vice versa to some degree. It's not a good or a bad thing. And so then the question is, I'm sure Samson's mom was praying for him too.
Sure.
But I think you're right. I mean, ultimately you lay the foundation, and there's a free choice that needs to take place. And that's a godly thing. I mean, God gives us a free choice. And I think as parents, we need to give our kids a free choice.
Yeah,
Marvin,
it's hard though.
you wanted to say something.
Sure. So if the question is, how much control do we really have as parents in terms of how our children turn out? I think we have a lot and we have none, right? I think with the story of Eli and then his two ne'er-do-well sons, I think it was very clear why they turned out the way they did, right? From the Bible narrative, and that's because Eli didn't discipline them whatsoever, right? And they were just left to their own devices, and they ultimately exploited the power of their office, their position, to take advantage of the nation of Israel to horrible effect. I mean, they must have damaged the integrity and faith in the whole Levitical system to have the two sons of the high priest basically taking what they wanted from people. So to that extent, yeah, we have a lot of control. I mean, if you don't do the basics at home in terms of discipline on one hand, but then again, if you don't give them the basic love and nurturance those are probably the people who end up, the neighbors say, I think he was such a quiet guy, and then he went out and shot 20 people, right? But that being said, I mean, we don't really have any control, because as Jody was saying, they are each their individual free-willed person. And if there's anything I've learned, is that when we try to exert our will and our control to produce a result in the lives of our children, we often produce the opposite, because especially as they get older and they want to exert their own self-determination in life, you may be pressuring them to do what is objectively something good for them, but they may rebel against it because they sense that, hey, this shouldn't be you telling me what to do. It should be me making that choice, myself. And so, but maybe as a parent, one of the things I've learned is we really have to take the long view, right, of things, and not be so impatient because we want something right here and now for our children, because of that kind of dynamic where if we're too heavy-handed, we may actually push them into doing what we don't want them to do. But setting the example of trusting in God and, living out your priorities, that we say this is important, and then actually living that way yourself, and hopefully reflecting God's unconditional love. In the long term, what's so gratifying is that in the long term, if there's something I don't want to get too specific and violate my kids' privacy, but there are things that could be a years long struggle as a parent, and you are hoping and wishing and praying that they make the right decision, or they do this, they go that direction or this direction, knowing that you can't force them to in the moment. But when years later they do, I mean, that's just, so wonderful. But I think probably the most powerful thing you can do is what Hannah did. When I look at the years that I rebelled from God and was out in the world and doing, pretty self-destructive things, I do believe it was probably my mom's, nightly intercessional prayer that protected me from, some of my disasters of my own making.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think we're going to realize until we finally do get to heaven all that's going on behind the scenes. And I was going to say, I mean, I got teenagers, and there's nothing like a teenage daughter to point out the hypocrisy in your life. I mean, it's absolutely humbling, and you can't, control. And I'm looking at this question. I use that word, and now I just shudder that I even thought about using that. And so it's interesting because God ultimately gives us freedom of choice, and I think all his creation, freedom of choice. And it's interesting because I've seen families where some of the children stay true and some of them go their own ways. And I mean, from a big enough family, you kind of see it in cousins on both sides of the family, people coming and going a bit. And ultimately, what really struck me once was when someone said, ultimately, God the Father in heaven lost a third of his angels. So that third of his created beings that had the power of choice left him. And so it doesn't matter how good or how bad the family is. Often you don't really control that.
I think when in my previous professional life,
As a teacher or
yeah,
something else?
no, when I was working with kids, just reading though, I dealt with some parents, and a lot of them were evangelical, and I guess sometimes I was struck with a comment of like how this child is like God's child, but I just have the privilege of getting to raise them. but they're ultimately God's children. And I think sometimes, and that like kind of stuck out to me, because sometimes I think these are like my children, and what their success or their failure in life reflects on me. But really, God gives us all the power of choice to make our own decisions. And I think when we think of these as like God's children, and yeah, we do have the privilege to raise them in our home, just like our parents did us. I think sometimes it's a healthy perspective of like, these are God's children. And I just have the privilege, God has blessed me with these children in my own home to help them to ultimately be God's children. But I think when we do that as God's children instead of just my children, and whatever they do is like my failure or my success, like we can't, I mean, oftentimes we do try to live vicariously through our children, like, oh, well, we failed at this, so therefore they need to do better. But I think when we can think of them as God's children, ultimately, compared to just everything is about us, that's helpful.
That's interesting, because work can get stressful. And when I have that perspective and I say, God, these are your patients. This is your practice. These are your employees. I want to be your servant. Lead and guide me and help me to serve the way you want me to. All of a sudden, the pressure of it being all me goes away. And I think it's just human nature, and not necessarily a godly thing to think you can do everything on your own. I mean, so you reminded me of that. That was interesting. So let's dip into the last question before we run out of time totally. It's basically kind of an extension of the second question. It was just making the second question too long. So I said, once we become adults, how much of our upbringing do we bring with us, and how much can we change? And then it touches back on how much is nature, how much is nurture, and then examples in the Bible of people that made complete and total changes. I mean, I'm always struck by these people that have these great conversion stories. And it's kind of like, I was doing drugs and this and that, and my life was going to hell, literally. And then all of a sudden something happened, and now I'm the God-fearing man that I am. And I don't have that story. I mean, I'm an Adventist. I was born an Adventist. I had an opportunity to explore my faith and make a decision as to whether I wanted to stay an Adventist or go somewhere else. But ultimately, I felt like what I believed as an Adventist came the closest to any religion, that I could come up with, based on what the Bible had to say, and the leading, guiding of the Holy Spirit. But so I was thinking, in the Bible, who has made these radical changes? And there's some people. I think Paul in the Bible, you have on the way to Damascus, God coming down to him. And I often wonder, and I want the backstory on that someday, God gives us free choice. And boy, he came down. There must have been a lot going on behind the scenes, because he came down and Paul accepted and was completely one person one day, and then for the rest of his life, completely another person. And in a lot of ways, completely separate from what he had spent his whole life doing up until that day on the way to Damascus. So that's just an example from the Bible. So, I mean, what do we keep from our upbringing? What do we leave?
I think quite a bit. I mean, you and I can, I think a lot of our points of view come from how we were raised and the differences in how we were raised too. But I don't think it's a done deal. I was having this discussion with my sisters when I was with them last week, and how, like, just because somebody was raised a certain way doesn't mean that that's the way they're going to be. My brother-in-law comes from a split family, but that doesn't mean that that's what he has in mind for himself. I mean, he very much doesn't have that in mind for himself. And I mean, not to be critical of his family, but his parents are pretty random and he's not. And so I think that we get to kind of pick and choose how we want to do things. And I think sometimes, you know, you see the way you were raised and you're like, I definitely don't want that for my own children. I would never do that the same, or this worked and we by default fall into it. But I think also we get to pick and choose. And if we do by default fall into a certain pattern, then we have sometimes I think we have to conscientiously like examine that and say, is that really what I want, or do I need to be rethinking this?
Kosuke, unmute yourself and show us your face. There you go. Can't hear you.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know that we talked about the story, parables of the seed and soil and soil. Right. Yes. So you know that everybody got that seed, and I'm sure Eli's sons got a seed too. And he saw that how godly their father was, right? Yet they couldn't change their behavior, and they couldn't, honor God. And rather than that, they behaved very selfishly. On the other hand, there are many people who are atheists turn out to be Christians and worshiping God and pursuing God. So there isn't any good soil, as we discussed originally. Everybody has some soil and bad out, but unless that we maintain the soil, maybe the thorns grow and close the growth and couldn't harvest or produce a fruit. Versus that maybe that even that the soil that who is on the road or the stone, maybe that we can add more soil on it or transplant that the soil seed to the another soil. So my point is that as a parents, you know, I hope that I guided my children more that honoring God and give them opportunity to I cherish the talents to praise the God rather than playing a video game, for example. Many mistakes, but I believe that even the Eli's son's heart could be changed. And never know how they turn out. Even that originally good soil may not produce the fruit. So I think that constant prayer and the relationship with God, I think that's it.
Well, So I think going back to kind of Marvin's, not what he's shared today, but Marvin's ultimate, story of like, I think Marvin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded to me like you're kind of a young adult when you kind of went off on your own thing. And I think that like the prayers of your mom that you were talking about that make a difference. I think even though we think that our children are raised, like people can still change. And so we think that like, oh my goodness, look what they're doing. They're 20 something. And but yet that can all change again.
That's what I was going to say. Kosuke is referencing discipleship training that we were going through, and we were in the book of Mark talking about the farmer sowing the seed, and one of Jesus's first parables, and how some of the seed hits the hard path and just doesn't go anywhere. Some of the seed gets in the rocks and does go somewhere, but only short-lived. And then some of the seed gets choked out by the weeds. And then ultimately there's good soil that does produce fruit. And I think the conclusion we had at the discipleship training that Kosuke was referencing, and I'm wrapping things up with this, was that ultimately this soil wasn't necessarily just there. It had to be worked to some degree. And so that there is, in a lot of ways, no bad soil if someone is willing to let someone work in their life, and ultimately, I guess, God work in their life. And I think, and this is true with a lot of parables that Jesus gave, that not the different types of soils aren't necessarily different types of people all the time. I think sometimes within a lifetime, and I can see this in my own life, where there's just been that hardened path that nothing was going to get through to me. And that was my teenage years, where I didn't want to have anything to do with my family or anything. I was never going to do anything the way they did. And then there's been times in my life where there was, the rocks, and I just didn't have the depth that I needed. And then I feel like in a lot of ways it's in the weeds now. There's the pressures of work and life constantly coming at me, but it's God working in me. It's my wife helping me, my family, me helping my kids, and being part of my community that ultimately gets us to where God wants us, which is that good soil where he can work through you to produce fruit. And I think that's the goal for all of us. So I appreciate everyone being here. We were talking about Samuel. He's going to be showing up in the next couple chapters in this book, Patriarchs and Prophet. And appreciate you spending time exploring some things, listening to me when I monologue at times. But let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. And I do want to remind everyone that church is at 11:15. And so, and I think, is there going to be an online component to that, or is it in person? We're kind of in this transition. I think there's still an online Zoom component to it for those who aren't able to make it. And again, I'll reference you back to the church newsletter. And anyway, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this chance to spend some time looking back to the Old Testament and how you worked through people back then in this period of the Judges, where Samuel is the last of the judges, and transitioning into the kings that would rule Israel, ultimately David. It's good to see you work back then, because in many ways you work the same as you do now. And I ask that you do continue to work in our lives, make us the good soil that can produce the fruit for you, and help us to know, first of all, that we do have an influence on not only our children, but others, but we also have the opportunity to change. We don't have to be what our past has dictated, and that you are constantly working in our lives to give us a better future, and ultimately a future with you in a world made new someday. In your name, amen. All right, everyone. Church at 11:15. Hybrid, so you can either be there or join up with Zoom. And I want to thank all the people for calling